In this module, we'll be removing any of the assets referenced by string to a directory and handle the kind of visual choices of that in their counterpart blueprints instead, so that we can see some of the benefits of working with those improvements we've now been making over the last couple of modules. Before jumping into this one, there's something that I hadn't noticed before. Obviously, it doesn't happen too often, but this kind of stuck out to me as another thing whilst developing for this course that could have some major impact, especially when you're working with teams. And that is something as simple as when you're launching the project. So, because I've launched this project and it has the incorrect string reference to that mesh, not only does that cause us problems in the project itself, with the mesh not being found and the spaceship not being displayed, which could confuse your programmer or your artist or whoever you're working with. It also means that if you have this in some sort of repository and someone pulls that mistake without you knowing that it's happened, maybe you've made that compile but didn't do a playtest just to check that one change, and you've pushed that to the full repository. Whenever anybody else then pulls that and is opening their project, they're going to be met with an error warning like this. So this is saying that the default property warning, there's an error. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense, even though I know what this is referring to because I created that problem on purpose. So to somebody who doesn't know what's changed or what's happening, that could look like quite a serious error before you even get into the project. So again, just another reason that even the official documentation kind of heavily recommends against using string asset references within your code files. So like I said, it's a very simple and very easy to overlook error or mistake to make, but once you've made that, it can have some very confusing and serious kind of repercussions, as we've seen in this project so far. So for the coding side of things, we'll only need to be making these changes in two of the files, and that's going to be for the pawn and the projectile. The game mode, although it's kind of setting the default pawn in the C++ class, that's fine. It's not hard referencing anything specifically by directory or string, and that can easily be overridden in the blueprint version without causing any errors. So I'm in the pawn class code file to begin with, and we're just going to go through in order and just check for any of the string references that we want to get rid of. The first one I can see here is our static constructor helper to find the mesh, which is currently not working anyway, so I'm just going to get rid of this line. That does mean we'll need to remove this object definition just here. And in fact, looking at, we can just remove that whole thing. We're creating the default sub-object here, so that static mesh will already be created when we create our blueprint class. So we can just get rid of this entirely, as that's the part controlling the visualization, and we'll do that in the visual part of the engine. And then if we keep going down, a similar thing we can do here, we're caching the sound effect. So this is creating a sound base, and yeah, it's directly assigning that to a file in the audio folder. So again, we're just going to not do that. And that means that the fire sound won't be set directly to an object, so we can remove the whole thing here. Okay, so that is the visual and the sound effect done. If we just double check in the header file, I think both of these, we've got the uStaticMesh as a U property, and the sound effect is also an exposed U property. So again, no reason not to do this in blueprints. Everything's actually already here for us to handle that in the blueprints, and we can set this very, very easily. So we'll just scroll through the rest of the class just to double check. So everything else I think is pretty much okay. We'll double check where we're playing the sound, which is going to be just below where we spawn the projectile. So we've already fixed the projectile reference there. We are doing the standard play sound at location, and we're using the sound file, which is fine because we can set that in our blueprint version. And with those changes made, I think that should all be fine. It should compile, and we'll fix any issues inside of the blueprint version. One other thing is that does mean we now also need less references, so we don't need any of these construction helpers, so it also cuts down on the number of libraries that we're including. So we've tidied this up in a few ways just by making those very simple changes. Okay, so I've just very quickly swapped over to the projectile class. So at the moment I'm in the header file, and again, I'm just double checking. I think everything here that we're going to be using is already exposed in the U properties, which is fine. Then if we hop over to the code file like we did previously, I'll just drop the includes down. I think we've already started removing things from here in the past, and I didn't look at the include. So we can get rid of the projectile movement component, as that isn't being referenced directly and we don't need that library. We can of course get rid of our asset reference. That then means that we can get rid of the set static mesh. And in fact, we also don't need the construction helpers here either, so we can get rid of that. That will then solve a few of the extra issues at the bottom. I'm not 100% sure what's going on here. We are setting up the attachment to the root component, which currently wouldn't exist, and then we're making the projectile mesh the root component. But as this is the template example, I'm not going to change too much here, as we still know this is working, but I think you could probably remove the setup attachment to the root component to begin with, but we're not trying to perfect this, we're just making some improvements to make our life easier. But yeah, play about with that if you wanted. It's not something I've tested, I just noticed as we're going through it now that probably isn't doing anything. We can also remove, though, our includes. Again, the ones that we're now not using, we've tidied up a few of the library includes by getting rid of those. And I think, again, that is pretty much everything. There's no signs or anything being created here. So if those changes made, go ahead and compile that, and just make sure, again, you haven't deleted any extra semicolons or anything. And with that compile done, that was super fast for me. I'm just going to head back over to the engine. Okay, so in the engine, just going to do a quick hot reload, make sure, again, all of that is being processed on both sides. Hopefully none of the changes there were big enough to need a system restart, so we can start checking some of our improvements. So the first thing we're going to do is the final class that we haven't made a blueprint of yet is the pawn class. So if we just right click on the twin stick pawn, again, we're going to go to create blueprint class. And this one I'll just call BP underscore pawn. Put this in the blueprints folder and choose to create the pawn class. So this is going to be one of the first classes with some issues. So what we want to do, we have a projectile. We need to make sure we fill the projectiles we've done in the editor before. I'll set this to default to slow. I just kind of preferred the slow projectile. We have all of these values coming over from the C++ defaults, which are going to be perfectly fine. And we also want to make sure that we have a fire signs to play, because remember, we've removed our hard reference from that in the C++ code. The other thing to note is we should have the ship mesh component, and that's going to be empty as well. Perfectly fine. We can just drop in the twin stick UFO v2. So again, this now means it's going to be very, very simple to track when and where this mesh is being moved between folders, renamed. And if it does, it doesn't matter. This is all going to be controlled and referenced by the redirectors, meaning that we shouldn't ever have nothing in this slot. So with those changes made, I think that's the pawn class ready to go. We're just going to need to go and make some similar changes now in the projectile classes. So I'm just going to shift select all of these openings. I think the static meshes will probably have lost their reference for now. So yeah, it's forgot what was meant to be in here. So I'm just going to replace this with the projectile mesh for all of these. A nice simple task, but this now means that once we've done that, we shouldn't need to do this again. Not super important here though, it was just 3 things to change very quickly. And again, we can still see all of that was much quicker than if we were needing to do that in C++ and trying to recompile and get all of those references correct, the directory references. So that now brings us more in line with what the documentation was recommending, and not using those references and doing the visual and kind of more design oriented things like even just assigning sound effects, not necessarily purely visual, but more design oriented. All of that should be handled kind of engine side and preferably in blueprints rather than doing it in a level on a per class basis. And of course, the main thing now is that means that however many BP underscore pawns we drag in, they're all going to have the same variables as the blueprint version did. Whereas if we do that with our C++ class, we'd need to change the variables of that pawn when it's in the world, and dragging any future C++ versions would lose all of that information between levels and stuff. And that, of course, tends to not be super useful. The other thing, like I said, is if we go back in and let's change this to version 3, so this is the 3rd iteration of the UFO. We can even put this in the audio folder just for fun, go back into the pawn class, and we've got UFO v3 already kind of updated, and all of that's been passed through into the blueprint, nothing's broken. We can push this to the repository, we can close the project, open that back up, and we're not going to have any of those errors when you load the project in the same way. Okay, but just because that kind of makes me feel a little bit uneasy, I'm going to put this back into the meshes folder where it belongs, and that kind of wraps up this module. So in this module, we've seen the drawbacks of using string directory references. We've then removed the directory references and made sure to set the assets through the editor inside of all of the blueprint classes that we've been making.